Chapter 2, Part 2. After the transaction was complete, the Durant brothers rode out. They made their camp off the road a mile away. David got the fire going. It was at full blaze, settling to a steady burn, when Matthew came back with more fuel. He set the bigger pieces into a pile and sat across from David. He watched his little brother turning his hands in front of the flames to warm them. "You all right?" Matthew asked. David looked up from the fire. "Yeah, I suppose." "Sorry I didn't tell you the whole story before." David nodded. He was silent for a stretch. "Is there more?" "More what?" "More to the story." "Oh, shit. Not really." "Well, it sounds like maybe there is." Matthew laughed. "I'm not sure I want to do this, Matthew." "To do what?" Matthew asked. "Kidnap Indian kids and take them south." Matthew laughed again and shook his head. "We're not kidnapping them. We're delivering them to school. We'll be official deputies and everything. And it's not like we're taking them to prison. We're running them down to a bunch of Catholics. The kids are going to learn reading and writing and arithmetic. They're going to get fed and housed and have the fear of God slapped into them by nuns and priests. And when they're 17, they'll let them loose in the wild. Learned, Christy folks instead of a pack of wild savages. Civilizing them. Nothing wrong with that. We'll be doing them a good turn." David shook his head. "Still doesn't seem right. Don't you think that if it was what they wanted, they'd deliver them to Vancouver themselves? And why is the church paying a bounty if it's all for the good?" Matthew shrugged. "Here's the thing. The Indians don't necessarily know what's best for themselves, so the government and the Catholics aim to teach them. I know you wouldn't have gone to school unless Mama made you, would you? This isn't different from that. But the Tagish mamas don't know it's for the good of their kids, and regardless, I can tell you this, it's better than what's come before. Papa ever tell you about Cypress Hills?" David paused at the mention of his father. "You never heard of the Cypress Hills massacre?" Matthew asked. "No," David replied. Matthew let out a long sigh. "He used to tell me about it when he was slurring drunk, like he was bragging, or warning me what he could do if he set his mind to it. This was after the American War. Papa had come back up to Saskatchewan or thereabouts. A bunch of American wolf hunters. I think Papa served with a couple of them in the war. Crossed the border, and he met him there. And they made camp and hit the bottle. Probably singing marching songs and reminiscing about killing bluecoats. But when they woke up the next morning, some of their horses had wandered off. Well, they were on Assiniboine land. Not that they cared much. They had a big wolf pack on the run and weren't thinking about borders per se. They were thinking about pelts and money. Anyway, they figured their horses got stolen by the Indians. Papa got some trappers to show them where the Assiniboine were camped, and they lucked into finding one of their horses nearby. Assumed it was confirmation of the theft, when it was probably just dumb luck. Bad luck for the Indians. As I said, Papa and those boys had been up to their snoots in the bottle the night before, and the Indian folk they ran into likely been doing the same. Tempers ran hot, and I figure they must all still been high as kites, because Papa's pals went on a goddamn rampage. Somebody said something rash that pissed the Assiniboine off well and good. One of the younger Injuns started stripping down for battle. Before he got a shirt over his head, one of the Americans pulled his piece and shot him in the belly. And then all hell broke loose. Before it was over, they killed a baker's dozen of the Assiniboine, all comers. I'm guessing there was rape and robbery too, though Papa didn't make mention of that. After it was all said and done, his pals sobered up, ran back to America. Papa headed west, ended up in Hope. Planted himself there and didn't look back unless he was far gone in the bottle. David had not heard of it. It's the whole reason the Northwest Mounties formed up. You got to keep the Americans on their side of the border and the Indians on our side and out of trouble. Now, these schools we're talking about, they're part of the solution. It's not like they were invented yesterday. The Catholics, the Anglicans, even the Presbyterians been taking Indian kids to their boarding schools for a long time. It's just expanding now. And we can be part of it. Get a good return. It still feels wrong. Nah, it's progress. Less than 100 years ago, you could collect a bounty for scalps. Now, you deliver the Indian live and well, scalp still attached. The head priest in Vancouver says, we're killing the Indian inside the Indian instead of killing the Indian. Matthew laughed. A little roundabout, but seems like progress for sure. David nodded. Progress. Sure. David and Matthew sat inside the smoke-filled Tagish Lodge. They wore the uniforms of Northwest Mounted Police. The red coats and blue pants were poorly cut, as the work had been farmed out for slave wages to the Canadian penal system. The prisoners, who may have been reasonably talented criminals, were less than gifted tailors, it seemed. Despite the cold outside, the heat in the lodge was oppressive. They'd been talking back and forth for more than an hour. It was slow-going torture. David stretched the neck to get the itchy wool off his skin. Through the open doorway, he saw the island at the heart of the lake, a massive turtle's back, rising out of the ice-cold water, surrounded by the snow caps of the distant Yukon's peaks, all flowing up to a perfect, cloudless, turquoise sky that begged him to escape into it. The Tagish elder, Frank Nantuck, sat across from Matthew and listened silently as he told of the wonders of a Catholic education. The lodge's other residents sat behind Frank, listening patiently while Matthew made his pitch with a deft, respectful charm. One of the children, who could not have been more than 10, smiled shyly at David. David smiled back. Frank raised his hand, and Matthew stopped mid-sentence. We have an Anglican school nearby. Why send our children away, all the way down to Vancouver? A world away? Frank asked. Matthew shrugged. Well, the Catholics are a cut above. If you want your children to have the best education possible, the Catholic school in Vancouver is superior in every way. Tell me the truth. Are you happy with the education your children are getting from the Anglicans? There was silence before Frank spoke. The grim faces on the parents behind him answered the question before he did. No, said Frank. And why not? Asked Matthew. Hard to recognize them when they come back spouting Jesus. And I mean no offense to your Jesus, he says many wise things. But our children come back saying Jesus is the only way, and ashamed of themselves, ashamed of their parents, ashamed of their history. Matthew nodded, somber. I understand. Frank turned to his family. He waved the 9-year-old boy forward. This is my grandson, Jim. Hello, Jim, Matthew said with a smile. Hello, Jim replied. Frank sat Jim next to him and hugged him around the shoulder. There is nothing in this world more precious to me than this boy. Why should I give him up to you and the Canadian government, Matthew? Well, first, you know it's the law. No one wants to see more Tagish arrested, least of all me. We've had a good business relationship, you and I, and I'll always be indebted to you for the arrangements that we made that let me trap and hunt on your land. Unless you'd say otherwise, I feel I always treated you fair when it came time to compensate. Frank Nantuck bobbed his head in agreement. He had become a wealthy man by letting Matthew and his crew poach on Tagish lands. Matthew continued. By Canadian law, all Native children have to attend residential school from age of 5 to 17. So you can send them to the Anglican school, which you don't seem satisfied with. Or we can deliver them safe and sound down to Vancouver, then bring them back. confirmed in their relationship with Jesus, educated in the ways of the modern world, and ready to lead your people into this new century. It really is that simple. Frank revealed nothing. Matthew played his last card. There's also the matter of restitution. The Canadian government is allotting a certain dollar figure per child for their schooling, but the children have to be there for it to get paid out. The government can't just go handing out money willy-nilly. There's got to be an accounting. For every Tagish child that attends the Catholic school, I can guarantee you 10 Canadian pounds. Frank mulled that over before he spoke. So for 100 children, that is 1,000 Canadian pounds. That's the figure, for certain. Frank was quiet for a time. Why don't the Anglicans pay? Well, sir, I hate to tell you this. The Anglicans receive the same amount of money from the government per student, but they keep it for themselves. A murmur played through the lodge at the revelation. Matthew raised a hand. I'm not saying that the Anglicans are bad men. If the Catholic school in Vancouver was filled to the brimming, as the Anglican school up here is, I'm sure they'd be doing the same. But the Catholics are sorely wanting for students. They could end up shut down if they don't fill their classrooms, you understand? The Canadian government will send the Catholics money every year for every student that they have. Frank asked. Matthew nodded. Yes. So the Catholics will send us money every year that our children are there. Matthew paused. I am fairly certain that if I talk with the Monsignor, something can be arranged. You can guarantee 10 pounds for every Tagish student every year. I don't think the Catholics will have any argument against that. Frank tousled his grandson's hair. Little Jim smiled and leaned into his elder's embrace. Frank spoke to him in Tagish, and the boy stood and returned to his mother. Frank looked back to Matthew. We must discuss amongst ourselves, Matthew. Come back in a week's time. Matthew nodded and smiled. We'll be here. Ultimately, it took 8 weeks of Matthew's charm, guile, bribery, threats of eternal damnation, and force of will, but he got commitments from Frank Nantuck and the other Tagish elders. They delivered 114 of their children, ages 4 to 15, to Carcross on the designated day. Matthew used nearly the last of David's inheritance to book passage to Vancouver. Little Jim Nantuck left his grandfather's side and was the first to board the ship, assisted by David. From Vancouver, Matthew made a deal on credit to run the children via paddle boat up the Thompson River to Kamloops. When they approached the school itself, little Jim held tight to David's hand, awed by the priests and nuns draped in their long black cloth. David pried his fingers free and patted the little boy's shoulder as he ushered him forward. The head priest, Monsignor Magritte, had one of the nuns reckon out all of Matthew and David's expenses, along with 100 Canadian pounds per child. To Monsignor Magritte's joy, all 114 of the children had arrived at the Kamloops Residential Indian School alive and well. They would not leave there in the same fashion. Little Jim held a brittle, ancient nun, Sister Marian Kelly, by the hand. He waved goodbye to David as the brothers walked away from the Kamloops school. David waved, then looked to the waiting paddle boat. He could not bring himself to look back at the children they had left behind. There was a choking emotion in his throat, but he forced it down and spoke. Matthew, I don't want to do that again. Do what? I don't want to run any more Indian kids down here. Yeah, neither do I. And the pickings would be slim. I think we got every last heathen child the Tagish had been holding back from the fucking Anglicans. David nodded. Anyway, Matthew hefted the cash box. In case you hadn't noticed, we're bona fide rich men. We're going to take this money back to Carcross, pay off Hamish and the Tagish, then grow richer still, little brother. Matthew and David went back through Vancouver and turned north again. The cash box was brimming with money passed through the Catholics by the Canadian government. After paying Frank Nantuck and Hamish Jarmish their cuts, Matthew knew exactly how he intended to invest the remaining financial returns. The brothers arrived back in Skagway alive and well. They would not leave there in the same fashion.